con mi voz soberana, voz que nunca ha fracasado. Estos versos he preparado del alma con sus primores. Ahí van mis versos cantores, pues nadie me lo ha enseñado.
Cuba was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492. 19 years later, in 1511, became a Spanish colony until the end of the Spanish-American War. Cuba was then occupied by the United States from 1899 until 1902, when it became a republic. From 1906 to 1909, was again occupied by the US. The state's influence continued, but corrupt and graft-ridden governments were in power until Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959. Good evening. Welcome to Dead Air Live. My name is Jean-Augustin, and I will be your host for this evening. As you may have guessed already, the topic of our show tonight is Cuba. We will be discussing live with some guests that lived in Cuba at one period of their life or visited Cuba on their ideas and what they thought when they were in Cuba. And the Somerville Producers Group is putting this show together. We are a group of young men and women, professionals, working in Somerville and the neighborhood, trying to bring to you live some issues that you may be interested to see or hear about. Our telephone lines will be open, and I will appreciate a phone call to let me know how you feel about the subject yourself. Now, I'd like to introduce my guest, Al. And Al, what do you do, may I ask?
Well, I'm the director of the Elizabeth Peabody House right here in Somerville, and also a part-time faculty member at Boston University School of Social Work, which sponsored the trip that we just went on.
And you lived in Cuba?
No, we just visited Cuba for a 2-week period, this past December and January.
Okay. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you. I'm also a social worker, currently not working full-time, but I do assertiveness training workshops in the community. And I also visited Cuba just this past December with a group from the Boston University School of Social Work for 2 weeks.
Oh, terrific. Eduardo?
Hi, well, I'm a film and video maker working out of Villa Victoria in the South End. And I've been to Cuba 3 times, all of them with the Venceremos Brigade.
Oh, terrific. In fact, I think both Al and yourself, Eduardo, did some shooting or some video stuff, or I guess some slides when you were in Cuba, which we will be seeing later in the program. Well, the telephone number is 628-6750. If you have any idea or anything at all regarding the subject of Cuba, please give me a call. Let me know how you feel. I'm sure everybody else out there would like to know how you feel about Cuba. Now, I guess it's one thing we should try to clarify first. Since all 3 of you were in Cuba, I envy you because I've always loved to go to Cuba, but unfortunately I never were able to go. And Al, let me start with yourself. What do you think about communism? What is communism?
Well, first of all, you know, I don't really want to get into what I feel about communism because, like religion, that is a topic you can argue about for days and days. So I really would like to just explain what I saw, what I heard. What I saw in Cuba was that, you know, the revolution there has brought some vast improvement for the greater majority of the people in terms of their living standards. And, you know, it is a fact that it is a communist country. It is a fact that, you know, the Communist Party is in control. It is a fact also that really in terms of many human people-oriented services that they are outstanding, that people are high priority in Cuba. Education, health, social services in general, in many ways are very, very superior. So that people have top priority. There is no private property, you know, there are not large-scale landowners, there are not large companies except those owned by the government. And that is the way that communism exhibits itself in Cuba. There is no large-scale private property. But people have a, you know, even though it is a poor country, have an adequate standard of living, and not as consumer-oriented as we are. But on the whole, I'm very impressed with the progress that has been made since the revolution.
Barbara, about yourself, when you were down there, what did you gather as being communism in Cuba?
I think, like Al, it's clear that businesses are owned by the state. Property is owned by the state for the most part. What impressed me was that things were free, that education was totally free and open from the time that children would go to school up to the time where they reached their peak capacity. And they had the advantage of being able to go to school as far as that capacity would allow them. That psychiatric services were completely free. That people in nursing homes experienced that as completely free, and they social workers made sure that people continued to collect their pension checks while they were living in the nursing home. So that basically the basic human services were free to everyone. I didn't experience people having a lot, people dressed adequately but not gloriously or luxuriously. Food was rationed. People on the average, I was told, ate meat, let's say, once every 5 to 7 days, but that there was enough food. And that's something that I heard from even people who would approach us and say that they wanted to leave Cuba, as we did have conversations like that occasionally on the streets. Mostly young people said they wanted to leave, but they also said that the revolution had brought many wonderful things for the majority of people.
Terrific. Eduardo, I don't think we established that at the beginning of the show that you are Puerto Rican.
Right.
Because with your Spanish accent, people may think that you're a Cuban. So I think we should establish that you're Puerto Rican. And as a Puerto Rican in Cuba, with a Spanish background, being in a Spanish country, which is labeled as being communist, well, it has a communist system. What did you gather there as being communism? What was communism to you there?
I think that that you hit the clue. You know, for my experience in Cuba, I know the country pretty well. I've been there 3 times, a total of, I don't know, 15 weeks, the 3 times that I've been there. And as a Puerto Rican, you know, coming from Puerto Rico, there's historically very similarities in the histories of both islands. And to see, you know, Puerto Rico today and Cuba the way it is today, it's like drastic, you know, it's like seeing 2 extremes. I mean, there's you know, all the problems that we have in Puerto Rico, for example, today, have somehow been resolved. Now, on the other hand, there's, you know, I'm not saying that Cuba is perfect. They have a lot of hardship. They have a lot of, you know, it's been very hard on them with the U.S. blockade, you know, on Cuba. But I think for me, the most important or the most outstanding aspect of the Cuban Revolution are the children. You know, I've never seen children full of so much energy and so much awareness, you know, and so knowledgeable also about, you know, they would know aspects of Puerto Rican history that Puerto Ricans don't know. You know, so it's like the privileged group, or the, you know, the privileged people in Cuba are the children. You know, for me, that's like the most outstanding thing of the revolution.
Do you feel the same way, Barbara, about the children in Cuba?
Very much. I was very impressed with the children that we saw.
It's one thing you brought up, the fact that some of the people, even though they showed desire to leave Cuba, but at least, you know, they had food and they had everything. I mean, they were more or less, they said the system was working more or less from what I've gathered.
Right. I think the young people that wanted to leave, I think, had been beguiled by the materialism that they could not get in Cuba, and that they were seeing more and more through tourism, or that they heard about in letters from relatives that lived in North America now, and they wanted those things. They came up and were attracted to our tape cassettes and our zoom lens cameras and things like that. But basically they said that they had food, which they didn't have before, that children weren't going barefoot in the streets, which they were before, that they had access to education, which they did not have before.
And
I think that a good, you know, that you do find that in Cuba, but a good example would be like the people that came through Mariel, through the the
boat,
big exodus
the boat people,
of people that came, and it's the majority, a lot of those people came for that, came to the U.S. The jeans that they don't get, the sneakers, and all of this consumerism that have been flooded in Cuba through they get American stations from Miami and that type of thing. But I've met people that have got here in Boston from Mariel, and they they tell you the disappointment, because it's like they inflate the propaganda, and the American propaganda in Cuba inflates how wonderful the U.S. is.
I gather in Cuba it may be a lot more easier for people to find work, since I believe work is an essential part. I guess there is some kind of lead from the government for people to work, whereas here it's more or less you on your own, go wherever and to get a job. And in fact, I'm getting a cue that we have a tip, and the tip is cued. And now let's take a short look at the history leading up to the revolution, which we will talk about afterwards.
As 1981 approached, a group of social work students and teachers began a journey that would carry them from one end to the other of an island nation struggling to free itself from its past. These are some images of Cuba and its people that 4 members of that group feel will always be a part of them. In Cuba, the old and the new live together side by side. It was not always this way, however, but the day is approaching when most of the remnants of an earlier age will only be found in museums. The native population that peered out at the billowing sails of Christopher Columbus's ships could not have foreseen the slaughter that would end their existence barely 100 years later. African slaves were brought to the island by the tens of thousands in English slavers to replace the dwindling Indian laborers. This gave the Spanish conquerors the means to turn Cuba into a center of trade between the old world and the new. The Africans also brought a richness of culture that outlived the institution of slavery and provides modern Cuba with a rhythm of life that throbs with vitality and diversity. Slave revolts and trade wars repeatedly rocked the island, but Spain clung to its colony fiercely. In 1868, Cubans began a 30-year struggle for independence from Spain, led by such people as Céspedes, Gomez, Antonio Maceo, and the poet revolutionary José Martí. As the Cuban independentistas moved toward victory, the United States, whose economic influence had been steadily growing, entered the fray and laid claim to Caribbean domination. In the 1930s, alongside wealth, poverty prevails. Dictatorships rise and fall. The American grip tightens. And then, in 1952, Army officer Fulgencio Batista seizes power and pursues his bloody path. On July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro leads a small band of revolutionaries on an attack on the Moncada army barracks, striking the first blow that leads to imprisonment and exile, and a daring return to Cuba 3 years later. In 1959, after 2 years of guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, the revolutionaries enter Havana triumphant. The revolution has cast down the old system and pledged a new society.
I'd like to thank Steve Knapp for letting us use this tape, this wonderful tape on our show. And my name is Jean Augustine. Welcome to Dead Air Live. Our show tonight is Cuba. Our telephone line is open. I think it's about time that you out there give us a call and let us know anything that you think about Cuba. The telephone number is 628-6750. It's very important to hear from you, so we can know how you feel, if you like the show, if you don't like it, and your own personal views on Cuba. I think now it's time to go a little bit on the history of Cuba. And I did some research earlier before the show, trying to figure out before Cuba, before Castro, what was going on. And supposedly, well, as I said at the beginning of the show, Cuba was a Spanish colony and then became a republic in 1902, and then became under the American government twice, and finally they had the ball playing their own ball, and supposedly there were 3 major industries in Cuba at that time: sugar, tobacco, and prostitution. Because I remember people were talking about that in Haiti. Some people in Haiti were going to Cuba for the weekend, to the casinos to spend money, and with the women and all the wild life that was going on. Al, any ideas on Cuba before Castro, or anything before that?
Well, in the sort of just immediate past, was well known that United States gangsters were very welcome there by Batista. And as a matter of fact, anyone who saw the film The Godfather remembers the scenes in there that actually took place in Cuba, and how the high-level gangsters were having their big hotels there, and how drugs and prostitution flourished there. It was a wide open city for all kinds of crime and vice, etc. I still expected to see some of that when just coming back, or just coming there this past December. But in that respect, Cuba has changed a great deal. We saw absolutely no drugs there whatsoever, not even the slightest sniff of marijuana. We saw absolutely no drugs. And we also felt very free to walk around until the wee hours of the morning without being afraid of being hit over the head. There were always people on the street, and but it was in a very relaxed sort of fashion. So we didn't see any crime or things like that. From what we heard from some of the old timers, the situation before the revolution was really horrible. As a matter of fact, we saw pictures of the warden of the prison where Fidel was kept, and the man kept an alligator pond there. And just for the sheer hell of it, he would once in a while throw in a live prisoner for entertainment purposes, into that alligator pond. And those were the kind of excesses during the Batista regime. And literally hundreds of people were killed during that period.
Well, supposedly Castro made a few attempts, before 1959, trying to take over. In fact, I was reading about Castro himself. He came from, a semi-rich family because they had some lands, and which his father had really worked to get. And he went to school and then went to law school after that, had few problems with the government. Then he tried to get a couple people together, couple Cubans together, because during the time before Castro, especially in Batista's time period, it was more corruption and crimes, and it was some of the most dreadful things were happening in Cuba. And the sad thing was that at that time, they had the support from the US government. And then Che Guevara, who's an Argentine revolutionarist, which I'm sure you guys know about, helped Castro basically into the 1959 revolution. And in January 1st, 1959, and they took over the system and started doing some changes.
What's interesting about both the attempt in '53 that Castro and a few people that weren't slaughtered by the Batista regime who made it through prison, and then the second, the effective revolution in '59, is that it was begun with such a small group of people. It was like 135 men and women that undertook the first attempt, the attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, which is being celebrated for this entire year. It's the 30th anniversary, and it's hot doings in Cuba. There are decorations all over celebrating that event. But then again in '59, I was started with just a handful of people, and the word basically spread from there.
But yourself, Eduardo, it's fascinating to hear some of the things that were going in Cuba before Castro. And it was kind of, hey, everybody do whatever you can, grab whatever you can, and this is a free country, and this is it. And especially with the crimes on Batista and all the efforts that Castro put into securing this country and getting it together. What are your feelings about that?
Well, I think that that was the big blow that Castro gave to the U.S. because it was, the economy was completely controlled almost by the U.S. companies. The sugar cane, the tobacco, all the different aspects of the economy was so controlled by U.S. companies, and I think that that was also a big factor in isolating Cuba the way the U.S. did. It's had a blockade since '61, since 1961, and
Yeah. And in fact, as I said from the research I tried to do before this show, it looks like on the Castro, one of the things that his philosophy was to bring social and justice, equality to the people. And another thing, the dark people, the dark Cubans were not getting any good jobs, and they were having some hard time. And this is one of the things Castro also used to bring, the mass up and say, hey, this is our country. Let's try to get it together.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most telling points. You said before that Cuba was a free country. In effect, it was free only for the privileged class. Many of the hotels were off limits for blacks. Many of the beaches were off limits for Cubans. Many of the large estates, for instance, were owned by DuPont and families like that. And there were stretches there on Veradero Beach, some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, where Cubans had never set foot until 1959, you know, when in effect all that land and those properties got nationalized. But so it was really not a very free country, not if you were poor, and especially not if you were black. That has changed a great deal. We visited a large ceramics factory, for instance, where the manager was black. We saw people from top to bottom in both government and in the places we visited who were black, and obviously with a country where 60% of the people are of black descent, African descent, one way or the other, now it is a very integrated society.
So in other words, now people are not rich down there, but people are together and living. And in fact, I think the death toll in Cuba is less than some of the countries, most of the countries in South America, and less than most of the big countries.
I think it's less.
I'm sorry.
Isn't it less than America? North America.
Yes, the life expectancy, in fact, is 73, and the infant mortality rate is 18.5 per 1,000 live births, which is a better record than we have here in the United States.
I mean, this is dynamite, because here in the United States and in capitalist countries, we condemn the socialist and communist system because, you know, it's like a mortal sin to us. And I'm sure on their side, you know, they're saying the same. Capitalist system is a mortal sin. And personally, I feel that people should do what works for them. If it's communist, socialist, and capitalist, whatever works for you is definitely what the people should do. And in fact, I think there is, you know, music and dance in Cuba, the art, and which is very beautiful. At the beginning of the show, we saw some of these people dancing, and the Spanish music, I just love it. So why don't we see how the quality of life is reflected in some Cuban music and dances. And we'll be back in a few.
entre los pueblos.
Long live the friendship among the peoples.
Viva el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
Long live the Communist Party of Cuba.
Our telephone number is 628-6750. Please give us a call. Let us know how you feel about our show this evening. My name is Jean Augustin. I'm hosting the show for this evening. And if you just tune in, our show is on Cuba. We have some dynamite and terrific guests who are in Cuba and telling us about their experiences in Cuba. Cuba as a communist country, well, for some people it's good, for some people it's bad. Let's talk some more. Well, from this tape, it's tremendous. I think, Al, you worked on the tape, or was it you, Eduardo?
Yeah.
Eduardo, you worked on that tape. Okay, that was terrific with the dancing and the music, and oh God, it's terrific. Good stuff. And I'm sure art is very enriching down there.
Well, we taped this in last April and May. We went with the Venceremos Brigade in their trip to Cuba over there.
So that's North Americans going down.
It's a group of North Americans that has been going to Cuba since
before the boycott.
Since 1969 they've been going.
And it's still
to
going
Cuba.
on.
Right. The first group that went was to help out in the Zafra Millonaria, which is the harvest. They wanted the largest sugarcane harvest that they had, and a group of North Americans organized themselves to go and help out in that harvest. And ever since then, they worked in the sugarcane in the beginning because that was the priority of the economy at that point. For 1 year, they worked in the citrus, and then the rest of the time they've been working with housing, construction of housing and hospitals, different things like that.
In fact, so the housing point, it's one of the points I like to touch. We have a phone call. Why don't we find out what our first phone call for the evening? This is terrific. Daddy Alive, you're on. Can I help you?
Yes, I have a question, John.
Sure.
I enjoy your show and your guests very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about Cuba. Obviously, the cultural life of the country has not stagnated since the communist takeover, but what about religion of the country? Is it suppressed as it is in Soviet bloc countries such as Russia?
Okay, it's Barbara. Okay.
I had the opportunity with a number of the people on our group to visit a synagogue in Havana, one of 5 synagogues, and that was an informal meeting that wasn't prepared by our Cuba tour guide. And we spent the evening with 5 representatives from the synagogue. And although the number of Jewish people in the whole of the country is only 900, the people explained that there was not anti-Semitism there, that they were free to practice their religion, although the religion in a sense was dying out, and that was sad, that they were allowed to practice freely, that the government provided building materials to renovate the building. And also at different holidays, the government would send a plane to Canada to airlift special foods down so people could celebrate their religion.
Well, thank you for calling. Yes, this is one of the big issues about religion, because supposedly Castro is anti-religion. And I think that was a very good question that was brought up. And we have another phone call. Before we go to the other phone call, Al, apparently you wanted to add something?
Well, just that we saw evidence that religion was being practiced. We saw churches being renovated all over the country. We saw people wearing crosses. We went to the Central Cathedral in Havana where we saw more than 200 people worship. So I think that religion is definitely not being repressed.
So people have the opportunity to pray God, which is good. Okay. Daddy Alive, you on?
Hi, I was wondering a little bit about the health care in Cuba. I had heard that all the medical care is free, even for visitors on the island. And I was wondering if that's true, then how what incentives would there be for people to be doctors and to continue their education?
Okay, wants to answer this. Do you want to
Well, yeah. When I wanted to give like a little example. When the revolution happened, most of the doctors fled Cuba, fled to the U.S. or other countries, and so they prioritized in developing doctors. This is I think one of the questions that she's asking. And as they mentioned, healthcare is completely free. I've done my teeth in Cuba,
for free.
Right.
You don't have to be a Cuban citizen.
No.
Okay.
If you're visiting there, you need healthcare. They give it to you.
In fact, Senator Kennedy was working on something like that, for the United States to have free health care,
Right.
Which I think it's terrific. You didn't ask to get sick, so why should you pay for health care, especially you pay taxes?
But going back to the question of the doctors, as I mentioned before, when the revolution happened, most of the doctors fled. Today, Cuba exports doctors. They export doctors to Africa. There's doctors working in Nicaragua and other parts of the world. So in Vietnam. So that gives you, an example of the priority that they put into healthcare, that they overproduce.
Question:
to help.
The doctors left Cuba. Is it because they're not getting to be a millionaire, like doctors are getting to be millionaires in the States, or was it for some other reasons?
I think that prior to the revolution, I would assume, not having been there prior to the revolution, but that the medical industry was the same as the medical industry here, which means there aren't that many doctors who aren't grossing goodly salaries, certainly after maybe a in-between period while they're establishing their practices. And for those middle or upper class doctors, of which there were the majority in Cuba prior to the revolution, they had no great vested interest in staying where their wealth was going to be withdrawn from them.
Yes, Al.
We visited several polyclinics, as they're called, which are sort of general clinics for population centers of 25,000. We also visited a general hospital as well as a mental health hospital. And from comparison with the United States, I can say that the quality of healthcare is really superb. There's a lot of emphasis on well-being, namely preventative healthcare, rather than just dealing with people as they become ill. And the result is very dramatic. I think that the point that was made that Cuba is exporting healthcare at this point is very well taken. Cuba at this stage has 1,300 doctors in third world countries, and that is one of their major areas, literally, of helping other countries.
Well, I mean, this is terrific because most other countries next to Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, and all these other places, their mortality rate is so up and healthcare is so down. Doctors are leaving and they don't have enough. In fact, one question, Barbara, especially for you, not that I'm. As far as the women issue, because nowadays in the United States, women issue is such a big thing. Women liberation and equal rights amendment. Now, as a woman, and I'm sure probably you spoke to some women in Cuba. Let me generalize the question. How did you feel while you were down there, women were being treated? What is the entire women issue in Cuba?
Well, let me address that in the context of our visit to the Women's Federation. Certainly they are very much committed to women being helped into the workforce, and that is a priority. They are very much into women being helped into developing educational skills and overcoming illiteracy. That is a priority. I think it's seen more in an economic context than in a women's issue context. I don't think that women's issues are seen separately from the what's good for the economy and what's good for the country. And what's good for the country is to have all people actively and productively a part of that country, and women are a part of that. There were some questions that I had, that women, because they were being raised up and they were still a little bit behind, as what happens prior to the revolution and then becoming educated. They weren't necessarily in places of decision-making necessarily as much as men, like for instance in the People's Power, which is the local governing body. There were not as many, on the Isle of Youth specifically, where we spoke with a representative, there was only 9% women represented, but that they were working on that as a priority, and they saw that as a lacking, and I saw that commitment to changing that as being very positive.
That's terrific. We have another phone call, and let's hear what... Daddy Alive, you on?
Hello. I was glad to hear of your show on Cuba. I visited Cuba about 2.5 years ago, and there's a few things that struck me that I wanted to mention. When I saw the tape on the dancing and the music, the culture in Cuba is just amazing. I went with a media tour, and culture is promoted, music, the dance, through history, in the film, in radio, on TV. And one of the things that we found out are that musicians are graded from A to E, I think. And so that even in the local bars where people are playing music all the time, the people are paid for the work that they do. And that impressed me quite a bit. Another thing that when I went there, I was afraid to see how I would be greeted as an American. And one of the things that I learned that a lot when I was there was that in spite of the history of exploitation the United States has in Cuba, and in spite of the United States government undermining lots of things that are going on there now, there's the people differentiate between the government of the United States and the people who come to visit. And I felt warmly welcomed there, as most of the people in our group did.
Oh, terrific. Were you there as a student or as a tourist, or?
As a tourist in a group.
Oh, what year was that?
That was 2.5 years ago, just after a number of the people left from Mariel.
Oh, very good.
And one other point I wanted to make, something that you said, which was whatever works. You know, you mentioned whatever works. Mm-hmm. Country's what's important. Well, it's also important to ask who you ask whether it's working or not.
Okay, whether it's, whatever it is, if it's working, you should continue on doing it.
Well, there's many people who say this system here is working, right?
Okay.
Other people who say that it isn't, right?
True, especially with ergonomics.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for calling. Really appreciate that.
Right.
Okay, now we've had some terrific phone calls. They came one after the other, which tells us that people are watching the show, and I really thank you for calling. And we have some more time left. If you feel like giving us a call, the telephone is 628-6750. Give us a call. Let us know how you feel about it. Now let's try to touch education a little bit, because before Castro, from what I've read and what I've researched, people were not so much interested into education, and the government wasn't really promoting education, whereas now it is mandatory. And as I forgot which one of you mentioned earlier, was that education is free. Mm-hmm. So who wants to talk about that a little bit? Al?
Maybe I'd like to start off, John. First of all, in the general education, they have had two goals. First was the battle of the 6th grade, and then later on, once that battle was won, they now have the battle of the 9th grade, and that is literally to wipe out illiteracy. And at times, people just declare a moratorium on all the teachers and high school students, etc., go into the little villages and teach everybody reading and writing. And you see some really amazing stories as a result of this. I mean, education has a top priority, so top that even in that poor country, and Cuba is poor, they still make room to bring in 25,000 students from third world countries. We went on the Isle of Youth, where we saw high school students from Nicaragua as well as from Mozambique. Each high school had about 500 students, and they have a work-study program where people spend 3 hours in the citrus fields and then 4 hours in the classroom. And people stay there 3, 4, 5 years even in order to get a complete free education. And in addition to the education, they learn about crops and they learn about irrigation, the very life skills that many of those countries need.
So it is mandatory for these people to go to school, though, the primary level of education.
Yes, the primary level is mandatory for everyone, but I'm specifically at this point talking about the education for foreign students. Mm-hmm. 25,000 foreign students from 19 different countries. that the Cubans make free education available to. You know, it's, I think, is very symbolic of, you know, the heart that people have for foreigners. You know, I want to agree with the lady who called in who said that as an American, people were so outgoing and friendly that they do differentiate between the actions of the American government and the actions of the American people.
Also, the quality of the education was very telling. It was very clear that people were very, very knowledgeable of, like what I said, about other countries' histories. In the Nicaraguan school that we visited, they were asking us questions about the electoral system in America that just was absolutely phenomenal to me, that they knew when, you know, when the 4-year term of Reagan was up and what were we preparing to do, you know, about that. Were there people who had different feelings? Did we think he was going to get elected again? And you know, really, I felt advanced questions. Also, it was exciting to see, we visited a Pioneer Palace. Those are the children that you saw in the last tape with the scarves around their neck. And basically that's, it's a program that most of the school children up to the age of 14 are involved in, and they have access to circles of interest to promote vocational interests for children as very, very young. We saw 7-year-old boys and girls learning about nursing, learning about dentistry with actual dentist chairs and a dentist there to expose them to that, so that they could get an idea of what they perhaps had an expertise in and what they might be interested in pursuing.
From what I'm getting is, like they say in French, it's a country en marche, and a country heading toward progress, and regardless how everybody else in the world is looking, you know, is looking at them, and you know, it's the country really trying to improve quality for the life of their people, even though they may not have the American dream, which is one day you'll get rich, one day you'll become a millionaire, but at least everybody is surviving. Eduardo, before we went to the tape, you were talking a bit about housing. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on that? And how is housing in Cuba? Because over here, you know, the country is overpopulated and you don't have enough housing for people. Especially if you don't have $500, you can even get a 1-bedroom apartment here.
Well, that's, as I mentioned before, that's the priority #1 right now in the Cuban economy, because they need more housing. You know, they need to be be doing more construction. But I wasn't able to bring, you know, to give you an interview that we did in a housing project with a person there who was just walking into her apartment and invited, well, we invited ourselves in, and she explained to us that you know, she didn't pay any rent. People either they don't pay rent, or the rent is very, you know, it's so small, you know, it's such a small amount of their percentage. And let's say there's 3 or 4 people living in an apartment, you know, a daughter and a father and mother who are working. The income of one person of the family is taken, you know, to pay for the rent, you know, a percentage of that income.
I have an important question there, Eduardo. Recently, it struck me very much was the fact that when, I think it was about 2 weeks ago when we had the first storm, and the governor, the new elected governor of Massachusetts, Dukakis, was worried about 2,000 people not having a place to sleep at, you know, when we had the storm a couple of weeks ago. I mean, do things like that happen in Cuba for people not having a place to sleep at, regardless how poorly furnished it is or how terrible it is?
Well, I think, you know, really the basic, you know, the thing about Cuba, I think, is that you might not have commodities or luxuries, but your basic necessities are met, you know, like education, housing, health, food, you know, your basic needs are met. Unlike, you know, here, the richest country in the world, and there's people who don't have a place to live who will die because of the cold. You know, your basics are met over there, while here you could get a lot of luxuries if you have the money, but your basic needs are not met.
As a conclusion, we can say that in Cuba, people are guaranteed health care, education, housing, food, even though they will never get rich, they will never have money in the bank, but at least the basic needs for survival, they have it.
Well, I think that, you know, I think people have the money in the bank because you need the savings to you know, to develop an economy. But I think that what they don't have is the consumer luxury goods to spend the money in. You know, I think that's one of the problems that the Cubans have, that they don't have where to spend the money.
Right. They have the money in the bank.
They have
and
the
it sits
money
there.
in the bank. But
Well,
I might just say that there are some really luxury items that are being introduced that, for instance, if you are a very excellent and productive worker, you might be given a small car or a motorcycle or a free vacation at the beach, so that there are these extras that are being given to good workers.
yeah.
okay, I think we can spend days and days talking about Cuba, the progresses they've made and all this good stuff, and not having enough time to discuss and talk about some of the things that are going on in Cuba. And as I said earlier, communism or capitalism has a different meaning to each and every one of us. And again, what works is what should everybody do. If it works for you, fine. If it doesn't work for you, fine. But I condemn people that condemn other people for what they believe in. If you believe in communism and it's working for you, that's fine. You believe in capitalism and it's working for you, that's fine. I'd like to thank you, Al, Barbara, and Eduardo for being on the show this evening. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to talk about most of the things that we should talk about. And quickly, I'd like to tell you that on this show will be rebroadcast this coming Friday, February 11th at 7 p.m. and again next Tuesday, February the 15th at 8 p.m. If you didn't have a chance to see the show this evening or came in late, please tune in and this coming Friday at 7 and next Tuesday at 8 o'clock and watch the show. And I'd like to thank Charlie Tesh, director of the show. I rephrase that, John Jaffe, director of the show, because I just saw Charlie in the back there with one of the cameras. And switcher, Larry Yeager. Sound, Marsha Green. Video, John Pennington. Cameras, Paul Clover, BJ Plattner, and Charlie Tesh. Floor director, Claire Bish. Lightning, Charlie Tesh again. Larry Yeager and Paul. Special thanks to guest Barbara, Al, Eduardo, and Noel Herman for music, Colados, help with video, and Steve for some video we saw earlier. And this show was produced by John Pennington, who has put a lot of time in making a success of this show. And yours truly, Jean Augustin, as a host of the show. Thank you and good evening. See you again soon.